The slap was so powerful that the entire dining room froze in silence. Just a moment earlier, everyone had been enjoying Thanksgiving dinner together, sharing laughs and casual conversation. Then, without warning, my sister's hand struck my face with such force that my head jerked to the side. The fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with a loud metallic sound. No one reacted. No one said a word. Then my father slowly raised his arm and pointed toward the front door. "Get out." I looked at him in disbelief. His face was burning with anger. "You heard me," he said firmly. "Get out of my house and don't ever come back." My mother lowered her eyes to her plate. My sister sat there with a satisfied grin on her face. Outside, snow was falling across the driveway. The temperature had already dropped below freezing. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling the pain on my cheek. Then I gave a small nod. I picked up my coat, and I walked out into the cold night. By the following morning, everything had changed. My father no longer had a house. My mother no longer had a car. My sister no longer had the comfortable lifestyle she had enjoyed for years. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, my family was about to learn a truth they should have understood a very long time ago. Everything they believed belonged to them actually belonged to me. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how my family threw me out on Thanksgiving night and why they woke up the next morning with absolutely nothing. For most of my life, I was the daughter nobody seemed to notice. You probably know the kind of person I'm talking about. Every family seems to have one. The person who solves problems. The person who quietly pays the bills. The person who sacrifices without asking for recognition. And somehow, that person is often appreciated the least. That was me. My older sister Rachel was completely different. Rachel had always been the star of the family. Growing up, she could do almost anything and still avoid consequences. If she neglected her responsibilities, someone stepped in to handle them. If she made a poor choice, someone rushed to rescue her. If she hurt someone's feelings, excuses immediately appeared to justify her behavior. My parents called her spirited. Everyone else called her spoiled. I joined the army when I was 20 years old. At first, I enlisted because I wanted direction and purpose in my life. Later, I stayed because I discovered that military service suited me. Over the next 18 years, I served overseas, missed holidays with family, slept in tents, worked through storms, and spent birthdays on military bases thousands of miles from home. I earned every promotion through hard work and dedication. Nothing was handed to me. Everything I achieved, I earned. While I was building a career, Rachel drifted from one job to another. Whenever work became difficult, she quit. She borrowed money and rarely paid it back. She treated responsibility as if it were optional. Yet somehow, she remained the favorite child. For years, I convinced myself it didn't matter. I had my career. I had my self-respect. I had my own life. But there was one thing I never stopped doing: taking care of my family. About 15 years earlier, my father made a terrible investment that nearly cost my parents their home. Most people outside the family never knew how serious the situation had become. Neighbors believed my parents had recovered financially on their own. The truth was much different. I bought the house. Every legal document listed my name. Every mortgage payment came from my bank account. Every property tax payment came from me. Every insurance bill came from me. Every repair was paid for by me. The roof, the furnace, the plumbing, everything. But I never announced it to anyone. I wasn't looking for praise. I simply wanted my parents to have a safe place to live. Later, I also bought 2 vehicles. One for my father, one for my mother. Both titles were in my name. The insurance policies were in my name. The maintenance plans were in my name. Just like before, I never made a big deal about it. I simply handed over the keys and said, "Use them as long as you need." That happened years ago. Over time, the arrangement became normal. And that's where problems begin. When people become accustomed to receiving something, they stop seeing it as a gift. Eventually, they start believing it belongs to them. By the time this story began, my family had completely forgotten who was covering every expense. Or maybe they never cared enough to notice. Thanksgiving arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon. After finally receiving a few days of leave, I drove 3 hours from Fort Liberty to spend the holiday with my family. The house looked beautiful. Warm yellow light shined through the windows. The smell of turkey filled the air. Standing on the porch, I allowed myself a little hope. Maybe things would be different this year. Maybe we could enjoy one peaceful holiday together. I should have known better. The evening began well enough. Football played quietly on the television in the living room. The dining table was covered with food. My mother seemed happier than usual. Even Rachel appeared relaxed. For nearly 30 minutes, everything felt surprisingly pleasant. Then the conversation changed. One of Rachel's friends had recently become engaged. My mother mentioned it during dinner. Immediately, Rachel turned toward me. "So, Emily," she said with a smile I knew all too well. "Still single?" I shrugged. "Still happy." A few people laughed. Rachel didn't. She took a sip of wine before speaking again. "You know, at some point happiness isn't really the issue." I already knew where the conversation was heading. I had listened to versions of this speech for years. Do you ever think maybe nobody wants to spend their life with someone who's always acting like a soldier? The room grew quiet. I answered calmly. "I've been a soldier for 18 years. "Exactly," Rachel replied. My father gave a small chuckle. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Maybe men don't want someone who's always giving orders." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. I could have argued. I could have defended myself. Instead, I simply reached for my water glass. That seemed to irritate Rachel even more. She always wanted a reaction. Ignoring her was the one thing she hated most. "You think you're better than everyone because you wear a uniform." I looked directly at her. "No. Then why do you act like you're superior?" "I don't." The answer was honest. Simple. And apparently unacceptable. Rachel suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. "You know what your problem is?" I didn't respond. Then it happened. The slap came out of nowhere. The sound echoed through the dining room. Pain shot across my face instantly. For several seconds, nobody moved. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking. I could hear the television in the next room. I could hear my own breathing. Rachel stood there, breathing heavily. She looked proud of what she had done. I waited. Surely someone would speak up. My mother. My father. Anyone. Then my father pushed his chair back and stood. For a moment, I thought he was finally going to defend me. I was wrong. He pointed toward the door. "Get out." I stared at him. "What?" "You heard me." "Dad." "No. I've had enough of your attitude." "My attitude?" "Not the slap. Not the humiliation. My attitude. You upset everyone every time you come here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rachel crossed her arms and smiled smugly. My mother said absolutely nothing. Her silence hurt even more than the slap itself. Then my father spoke the words I will never forget. "Don't ever come back." Nobody objected. Nobody defended me. Nobody even looked ashamed. So I stood up. I picked up my coat. And I walked toward the front door. The freezing air hit my face the moment I stepped outside. Snow drifted through the darkness. The porch light glowed behind me. I reached my truck, opened the driver's door, and sat there for a long time. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. 18 years. Thousands of sacrifices. Millions of dollars. And this was how it ended. Eventually, I took out my phone and opened my laptop. I logged into a secure folder. Document after document appeared on the screen. Property deed. Vehicle titles. Insurance policies. Trust agreements. Every signature. Every record. Every asset. Everything legally belonged to me. I stared at the screen for several moments. Then I called my attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Emily." I looked back at the house glowing warmly through the falling snow. The house I had paid for. The house I had just been thrown out of. "Good evening, David." There was a brief pause. Then he heard something in my voice. "What happened?" I watched the snow collect on the windshield and finally said the words that would change everything. "It's time." David had been my attorney for nearly 12 years. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't panic. He didn't exaggerate. He listened carefully, gathered the facts, and took action. That was why I trusted him. After I explained everything that happened during Thanksgiving dinner, he remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he asked one question. Are you absolutely certain? I knew exactly what he was asking. He wasn't asking whether the slap happened. He wasn't asking whether my father threw me out. He was asking if I was finally ready to stop protecting people who had spent years taking advantage of me. I looked back at the house one last time. The lights glowed behind the curtains. Inside, they were probably eating dessert. Probably laughing again. Probably congratulating themselves for putting Emily in her place. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt at all. No, I said quietly. I'm not changing my mind. David let out a slow breath. Then we begin first thing tomorrow morning. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. I hardly slept. Not because I was upset. Strangely enough, I felt peaceful. The kind of peace that comes when a difficult decision has finally been made. For years, I had carried a burden I refused to acknowledge. I kept telling myself things would eventually get better. That my family would someday appreciate what I had done. That my father would eventually thank me. That Rachel would finally mature. That my mother would stop pretending not to see what was happening. But some people never change. Before sunrise, David's office started sending documents. There were no emotional messages. No threats. No revenge. Only facts. Legal notices. Ownership confirmations. Contract terminations. Every action had been prepared years earlier. Because despite everything, I had always protected myself legally. The house was never a gift. Legally, it never had been. The vehicles were never gifts. The insurance policies were never gifts. The entire arrangement existed for one reason. Because I allowed it to exist. And that arrangement was finally coming to an end. Around 8 o'clock that morning, my father received the first official email. I know exactly when it happened because about 15 minutes later, my phone started ringing. At the time, I was sitting alone in a small diner, drinking coffee and watching the morning traffic pass by. His name appeared on my screen. For a few seconds, I thought about ignoring the call. Instead, I answered. What the hell is this? He yelled immediately. No greeting. No apology. No mention of what had happened the night before. Just anger. I calmly stirred my coffee. What are you talking about? I asked. The notice. What notice? The house notice, damn it. I could almost picture him standing in the kitchen. His face red. His voice shaking with outrage. For years, he had convinced himself that the house belonged to him. Now reality had finally arrived. The notice explaining ownership? I asked. For a moment, there was silence. Then the shouting returned. You can't do this. Yes, I can. This is our home. No, I replied calmly. It's my home. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. For the first time, I think he understood that I wasn't bluffing. Then he changed his approach. You're overreacting. I almost laughed. It's funny how people suddenly become experts on being reasonable when they lose control of a situation. They create the problem, then accuse you of reacting too strongly. Am I? I asked. It was one argument. It wasn't one argument. You know what I mean. No, I replied. Actually, I don't. He became quiet. Then I continued. It wasn't one argument. It wasn't one slap. It wasn't one holiday. It was 18 years. His breathing became heavier. Then he said something that perfectly explained everything. You owe this family. I closed my eyes. There it was. The belief that had been driving this entire situation. Not gratitude. Not appreciation. Entitlement. Not thank you for buying the house. Not thank you for paying the taxes. Not thank you for helping us survive financially. Instead, he believed I owed them. That realization was strangely freeing. No, I said calmly. I don't. Then I ended the call. The next several hours became increasingly chaotic. By noon, every member of my family had learned at least part of the truth. Rachel was the first to start calling. 5 times. I ignored every single call. Then the text messages began arriving. What is going on? Call me. Dad says this is all a misunderstanding. And then my favorite message. Stop being dramatic. That almost made me laugh. The same woman who had slapped me during Thanksgiving dinner was accusing me of being dramatic. A few minutes later, my mother called. Unlike my father, she sounded scared. Emily. I hadn't heard uncertainty in her voice for years. Yes, your father says the house. It belongs to me. She didn't answer right away. Since when? I looked out the diner window. Snow covered the sidewalks. People rushed past carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Life was continuing as normal for everyone else. Meanwhile, my family was learning that the foundation of their comfortable lives had never been what they thought. Since 15 years ago. Another long silence. You never told us. That statement genuinely surprised me. Not because it wasn't true from her perspective. Because it completely ignored reality. I had told them. More than once. Many times, in fact. They simply never listened. Whenever paperwork required signatures, I explained everything. Whenever insurance documents arrived, I explained everything. Whenever tax records needed attention, I explained everything. But nobody paid attention. Details were boring. Details didn't matter. Until suddenly they did. I did tell you. Her voice became very quiet. Oh, that single word said more than an entire conversation. Deep down, she knew I was right. By mid-afternoon, David called with updates. Everything was moving forward exactly as planned. The occupancy agreement for the property had been terminated. Vehicle use permissions were being revoked. Insurance coverage would end according to the legal schedule. Every step followed state law perfectly. No shortcuts. No tricks. No revenge. Just ownership rights being exercised. As the day continued, old memories surfaced unexpectedly. Moments I hadn't thought about in years. The Christmas I spent overseas while paying for repairs on their home. The birthday I missed because my father needed financial help after another mistake. The vacation I canceled because Rachel couldn't afford her rent. Thousands of sacrifices. Thousands of choices. Every one of them made because I cared. Or at least because I thought I cared. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe it had never been love. Maybe it had been obligation. Late that afternoon, my cousin Megan called. Unlike most relatives, Megan had always treated me fairly. Emily, she said carefully, is this really happening? Yes. I just got off the phone with Rachel. I could easily imagine that conversation. Rachel crying. Rachel portraying herself as the victim. Rachel rewriting history. Then Megan said something that stayed with me. They honestly believed everything belonged to them. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Because she was right. They weren't pretending. They weren't acting. They genuinely believed it. Years of comfort had convinced them that generosity meant ownership. That dependence was a right. That support would last forever. By evening, the panic inside my parents' house was impossible to ignore. I later learned that Rachel spent hours searching through filing cabinets. She was desperately looking for proof that the house belonged to them. She didn't find any. Because no such proof existed. My father called 3 more times. Each conversation became angrier than the one before. Each call revealed more panic and frustration. Finally, shortly before sunset, he reached me again. What do you want? He demanded. The question surprised me. Not because it was difficult to answer. Because the answer was so simple. I wanted respect. Silence. I wanted basic decency. More silence. I wanted my family. His voice softened slightly. For the first time all day, he sounded less angry. Then he said something that erased any remaining doubt. So you're really doing all this over hurt feelings? I closed my eyes. After everything. After 18 years. After the slap. After being thrown out. After every sacrifice I had made. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about feelings. It wasn't. This was about consequences. And consequences had finally arrived. I looked at the darkening sky and answered quietly. I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. What? You told me to leave. A long silence followed. Then I spoke the words that finally ended the conversation. You said never come back. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, my father had absolutely nothing to say. The first week after Thanksgiving didn't feel like a family disagreement. It felt like watching a building slowly collapse. Not because I was trying to destroy anyone. I wasn't. Most of my days remained surprisingly normal. I returned to work, attended meetings, reviewed reports, exercised before sunrise. Life continued. The difference was that I had stopped carrying everyone else's burdens. And apparently, my family no longer knew how to stand on their own. The first major shock arrived 3 days after Thanksgiving. The SUV my father had driven for nearly 8 years was recovered by a vehicle service company. Everything was done legally, professionally, exactly according to the paperwork. My father was furious. Several relatives later told me he stood in the driveway yelling while the SUV was loaded onto a transport truck. Neighbors watched from their windows. For years, he had proudly called it his vehicle. Now he was learning otherwise. The second vehicle was taken the following afternoon. My mother's sedan. The same car she drove to church every Sunday. The same car she used for shopping, appointments, and family visits. She cried when it was removed. That bothered me more than I expected. Not because I regretted my decision, but because my mother had always been the complicated one. She wasn't cruel like Rachel. She wasn't aggressive like my father. Her biggest flaw was silence. She watched unfairness happen and convinced herself that staying quiet made her innocent. It didn't. But it did make everything harder. Another 3 days passed. Then another reality arrived. The automatic payments stopped. No more vehicle insurance. No more utility assistance. No more emergency household account. No more invisible financial support. For years, I had quietly covered expenses they barely noticed. Now those expenses became impossible to ignore. My phone rang constantly. Not from my parents. From relatives. Aunts. Uncles. Cousins. People who had never bothered to ask how I was doing suddenly had plenty of advice. Most conversations sounded the same. Maybe you've made your point. They're still family. Or my personal favorite. You only get one father. Funny how nobody ever said, you only get one daughter. One afternoon, while driving back from base, I received a call from my Aunt Linda. She had always considered herself the family peacemaker. Emily, she began carefully, don't you think this has gone far enough? I smiled despite myself. How far is far enough? There was a pause. Well, no, really, I said. How far? She struggled to answer. Because there wasn't a good answer. Everyone wanted forgiveness. Nobody wanted accountability. Finally, she sighed. Your father is under a lot of stress. I almost laughed. For 18 years, I had watched my father's stress become everyone else's burden. The bills, the mistakes, the consequences. Whenever something went wrong, someone else stepped in to absorb the damage. Most of the time, that someone was me. I was under a lot of stress when he threw me out, I replied. Linda fell silent. After a moment, she changed the subject. That happened often. The truth has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially when they've benefited from pretending not to see it. But the real explosion came the following week. Rachel showed up at my house. I hadn't spoken to her since Thanksgiving. Honestly, I hadn't planned to. The doorbell rang shortly after noon on a Saturday. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Rachel was standing on the porch. For a second, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked physically different. Because the confidence she always carried was gone. The smug smile was gone. The arrogance was gone. The certainty that someone else would always rescue her had disappeared. Her eyes were red. Her makeup was smeared. And for the first time in her life, she looked genuinely frightened. What do you want? I asked. Before I could stop her, she pushed past me and walked inside. Typical Rachel. Respecting boundaries had never been her strength. She marched into the living room and turned around. You've lost your mind. I calmly shut the door behind me. No. You're destroying Mom and Dad. No. Then what do you call this? I folded my arms. The consequences of their actions. Her face tightened with frustration. It was one argument. There it was again. The family strategy. Minimize everything. Reduce years of behavior into one isolated moment. Pretend the final incident was the only thing that mattered. It wasn't one argument, Rachel. My voice remained steady. The army had taught me something valuable over the years. The calmest person usually controls the room. Rachel hated that. You got slapped, she said, throwing her hands into the air. So what? I stared at her. A second later, she realized what she had said. But it was too late. So what? Not, I'm sorry. Not, I was wrong. Not, I shouldn't have done that. Just 2 words. So what? Years of entitlement summed up perfectly. Slowly, I nodded. Thank you. She frowned. For what? For finally being honest. Rachel looked confused. I continued. Because that's the real problem. What? You genuinely think hurting people doesn't matter? Her mouth opened, then closed. For once, she didn't have a response. Silence filled the room. Then an old memory surfaced. One I hadn't thought about in years. My 18th birthday. I had received my military acceptance paperwork. I remember sitting at the kitchen table feeling excited and nervous. My father barely glanced at it. Rachel had gotten herself into trouble again. The entire evening became about her. Not me. Her. Then another memory. My first deployment. Nobody came to the airport. Rachel needed help moving into a new apartment. My parents chose to help her instead. Then another memory. And another. And another. Thousands of moments. Nothing dramatic enough to become a family story. But together they created a pattern. A lifetime of always coming second. Rachel interrupted my thoughts. You're being cruel. That almost made me laugh. Cruel? The woman who slapped me. The family who threw me out. The people who spent years benefiting from my sacrifices. And somehow I was the cruel one. No, Rachel. I looked directly at her. For the first time in my life, I'm simply stopping. She stared at me. What does that mean? It means I'm done rescuing people who would never rescue me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then her expression changed. The anger faded. Fear took its place. Real fear. The kind that appears when someone realizes the safety net is gone. I can't afford this. There it was. The real issue. Not guilt. Not regret. Money. I waited. Eventually she continued. The apartment account. I blinked. What about it? Her face turned pale. The emergency account. I had almost forgotten about it. Years earlier, I had created a separate fund for family emergencies. Medical bills. Unexpected repairs. Temporary financial support. Rachel had quietly treated it like her personal backup account for years. After Thanksgiving, David had immediately removed access. Legally. Properly. Without hesitation. You closed it? Yes. She sat down heavily on the couch as if her legs had suddenly given out. For the first time, I saw genuine panic. Not manipulation. Not performance. Real panic. Rachel was finally facing adulthood. No backup plan. No rescuer. No Emily. Just consequences. She looked up at me. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" The answer came easily. Because most adults already know it. Work. Her eyes filled with tears. Then she broke down crying. Not quietly. Not politely. Full body sobs. Years of dependence colliding with reality. I watched silently. Not because I was being cruel. Because I understood something important. Some lessons cannot be explained. They have to be experienced. Eventually, she left. The front door closed behind her. The house became quiet once again. That evening, I sat alone on my back porch. Snow drifted across the yard. The air was cold. The stars were bright. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Then my phone vibrated. A text message from my mother. Only 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at the screen for a long time. Something felt different. The message wasn't demanding. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't defensive. It sounded tired. Very tired. And deep down, I knew something had changed. For the first time since Thanksgiving, my mother wasn't contacting me because she needed money. She was reaching out because the illusion had finally fallen apart. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted her to worry. I simply needed time. For most of my life, every family conversation followed the same pattern. Someone hurt me. I absorbed it. Then I moved on. Over and over again. It became normal. But normal isn't always healthy. Sometimes normal is just another word for tolerated. The message remained unanswered for nearly 24 hours. Finally, I replied. When and where? Her response arrived almost instantly. Tomorrow. Noon. Maple Grove Cafe. Just us. I wasn't sure I believed that last part. As it turned out, I was right. The next afternoon, I arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe sat beside a frozen pond on the edge of town. It was quiet and cozy. Warm lights. Wooden tables. The smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon. The kind of place where people speak softly. The kind of place where family drama feels completely out of place. But the moment I walked in, I saw them. All three of them. My mother. My father. Rachel. Waiting together. I stopped briefly. Not because I was surprised. Part of me expected it. My father sat stiffly in his chair. Rachel looked exhausted. My mother looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. The previous 2 weeks had clearly taken a toll on her. I approached the table. Nobody spoke. Finally, I sat down. The silence lasted long enough for a waitress to arrive and take drink orders. Only after she left did my father speak. You tricked us. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. Somehow, he had managed to make himself the victim again. No. His jaw tightened. You hid everything. I didn't hide anything. Then why didn't we know? The answer came instantly. Because you never listened. But I didn't say it yet. Instead, I opened the leather folder I had brought with me. Inside was a thick stack of documents. Paper has a powerful effect on people. Opinions can be debated. Facts are harder to argue with. I slid the first document across the table. The property deed. At the top was my name. Owner, Emily Carter. Rachel stared at it. My mother stared at it. My father looked away. Then I placed another document on the table. Property tax records covering 15 years. Every payment. Every receipt. Every dollar. My name. Then another document. Insurance records. Then another. Mortgage records. Then another. Repair invoices. The stack grew larger. The silence grew heavier. Finally, my mother picked up one of the pages. Her hands trembled slightly. These are all yours? Yes. She turned another page. Then another. Then another. Her eyes widened. For the first time, she wasn't hearing guesses. She was seeing numbers. Real numbers. Roof replacement, $22,000. Furnace replacement, $9,000. Foundation repairs, $16,000. Property taxes year after year after year. Thousands. Tens of thousands.